Have you ever looked into a mirror and felt, just for a fleeting second, that the reflection staring back at you wasn't entirely yours? In the Middle Ages, people weren't just unsettled by this feeling, they were terrified, because to them, mirrors were not simple sheets of polished glass. They were doorways, portals, silent traps that could snatch your soul if you weren't careful. Imagine walking through a dim medieval cottage where candlelight flickers against rough wooden beams. On the wall hangs a small, hand-polished piece of metal, your only mirror. The villagers whisper, "Never stare too long, or the mirror might capture a piece of your spirit. Never let a child gaze into it, or their innocence could be stolen. And never, under any circumstance, allow the dying to see their reflection, because the mirror would snatch their soul before it could rise to heaven." This was not some fringe superstition. Across Europe, people believed mirrors held power over life and death. They covered them during funerals, smashed them to undo curses, and passed down stories of souls trapped behind the glass, forever watching. So tonight, let's travel back into medieval times. Together we'll uncover why mirrors were so deeply feared, where these strange beliefs began, and how they linger in forgotten history, even today. To understand this fear, we need to step into the world of the Middle Ages. Picture yourself in a small medieval village. The streets are muddy, the air smells of wood smoke, and life is ruled by superstition. Medicine is primitive, and death is never far away. Plagues, famines, and wars shape daily survival. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, people cling to signs, omens, and rituals for comfort. Mirrors in this world are rare treasures. Unlike the clean glass reflections we know today, medieval mirrors were usually polished metal, bronze, silver, or even obsidian. Their reflections were hazy, distorted, and ghostly. Looking into one was less like seeing yourself and more like peering into another realm, a blurred double world where your soul might be lurking. And here lies the heart of the fear. If a mirror could show your soul, then surely it could also hold your soul. In medieval thought, reflections weren't just optical illusions, they were a part of you, your essence, made visible. Losing control of that reflection meant risking your very spirit. The fear didn't start in Europe. Ancient cultures carried similar beliefs. In ancient Rome, breaking a mirror was thought to curse you with 7 years of misfortune. In China, mirrors were believed to repel evil spirits, but also to reveal the hidden truth of one's soul. By the Middle Ages, these ideas fused with Christian beliefs about the afterlife, creating a potent mixture of awe and dread. Mirrors became not only practical objects, but spiritual battlegrounds. And that is why when someone died, mirrors were covered. If left exposed, it was believed they could trap the wandering soul of the deceased, locking it away from eternal rest. But this was only the beginning. The deeper we go, the stranger these fears become. Because mirrors weren't just about death, they became tools of magic, omens of bad luck, and even evidence in bizarre medieval trials. Death was ever present in the Middle Ages, and rituals surrounding it were layered with superstition. Mirrors played a curious role in this. When someone in a household died, it was common practice to immediately cover every mirror. Picture a small wooden room, family crowded around a dying relative. As soon as the final breath escaped, cloths would be draped over every reflective surface. Why? To prevent the departing soul from being caught, like a moth in a web, unable to journey to heaven. This fear was so widespread that even today, echoes of it survive in some cultures. In parts of Eastern Europe, mirrors are still covered during wakes. In Jewish tradition, mirrors are also covered during mourning, not out of fear of soul trapping, but to turn focus away from vanity at a time of grief. But the medieval route was clear. The mirror could capture. Imagine the terror. If a soul became trapped, it might linger as a restless spirit, a ghost condemned to stare from the glass for eternity. Villagers whispered about seeing strange shadows in mirrors, movements that didn't belong to the living observer. Some even claimed to hear faint whispers when standing too long before one. And if that wasn't enough, the idea of breaking a mirror carried its own curse. Many believed that to shatter a mirror was to shatter the soul's reflection within it, dooming the person to misfortune or even madness. The 7 years of bad luck we still joke about today has roots in this ancient dread. So what did medieval people do when a mirror was broken? Some buried the shards deep underground, others washed them in running water to cleanse the soul, and some carried out small rituals, whispering prayers over the fragments. To them, these weren't silly superstitions. They were necessary safeguards against forces that lurked in the unseen. But the story doesn't end with death. In fact, mirrors were also drawn into the strange world of medieval magic, where sorcerers, seers, and charlatans used them not just to reveal souls, but to summon powers beyond imagination. If death made people cautious about mirrors, magic made them truly dangerous. In medieval times, the boundary between science, superstition, and sorcery was thin. Anything mysterious could be a tool for divination, and mirrors were no exception. Imagine a candlelit chamber, smoke curling from a dish of herbs, and in the middle of the table sits a polished mirror. The sorcerer, or perhaps just a curious villager, stares deeply into its surface, waiting for visions to form. This practice, called scrying, was believed to open a gateway to hidden knowledge. Scrying was not uniquely medieval. It stretched back to ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. But in the Middle Ages, it became entangled with Christian fears of the devil. To scry into a mirror was to risk calling upon demonic forces who might show you the future but demand your soul in return. Medieval texts even warn of mirrors being used to speak with spirits. Alchemists, scholars, and wandering mystics claimed they could contact angels, or more often demons, by gazing into reflective surfaces. In some cases, polished bowls of water or obsidian mirrors were favored, thought to provide a clearer path into the unseen world. The Church grew deeply suspicious of mirror magic. By the 13th and 14th centuries, scrying was associated with witchcraft and forbidden practices. In sermons, priests warned that mirrors were the devil's looking glass, objects that tricked people into vanity and temptation. Even ordinary villagers absorbed these fears. To keep children safe, some parents forbade them from looking into mirrors at night. Others placed crosses or holy water near mirrors, especially during storms or plagues, fearing that evil spirits could slip through during moments of weakness. As witch trials swept across Europe, mirrors occasionally appeared as evidence. If a woman was accused of using a mirror to cast spells, or worse, to steal the souls of neighbors, it could be cited in court. While less common than charms or herbs, mirrors still carried suspicion. One story tells of a trial in 16th century Germany where a woman was accused of using a mirror to draw sickness into her enemies. Witnesses swore that when she stared into the glass, her victims wasted away. Whether true or not, the belief itself was powerful enough to condemn her. And yet, not all mirror magic was feared. Some believed mirrors could protect as well as harm. Small polished discs were worn as amulets to ward off the evil eye. Others placed mirrors in windows to bounce back curses or bad luck sent by jealous neighbors. This dual nature, danger and defense, made mirrors deeply ambiguous. They were both tools of sorcery and shields against it. But perhaps the strangest role mirrors played was in law and daily ritual. Because in the medieval world, mirrors weren't only feared, they were sometimes legislated. And that's where our story bends even darker. Life in the Middle Ages was ruled not just by the Church, but by laws that regulated even the most bizarre parts of daily existence. And mirrors, strange as it sounds, were not exempt. In some villages, it was considered dangerous for a bride to look into a mirror on her wedding day. Why? Because doing so might split her soul, inviting misfortune into the marriage. As a result, strange rules developed. Brides were often only allowed to glance briefly, or not at all, before the ceremony. In Italy and France, there are records of laws warning against using mirrors in certain rituals. Authorities feared they could disturb the order of the soul or encourage magical practices. Medieval rulers and clergy recognized that superstitions, whether real or not, helped keep people in line. By reinforcing the fear of mirrors, they could discourage vanity and curiosity, both seen as sinful. After all, too much gazing at one's own reflection was linked to pride, the deadliest of sins. Thus strange rules emerged. In some areas, breaking a mirror wasn't just bad luck. It could result in a fine since people feared the curse might spread to neighbors. In others, mirrors were banned from sick rooms because illness was thought to weaken the soul, making it easier for the mirror to steal it. Beyond laws, ordinary villagers developed their own protective rituals. Some would spit on mirrors to fog the soul's reflection before leaving the house. Others tapped the surface 3 times before looking in, a gesture believed to wake the soul and prevent it from getting trapped. And if you happened to drop a mirror, some whispered a quick prayer, others rushed to touch wood, iron, or even salt, materials thought to ground the soul back to the body. These daily gestures reveal just how much mirrors haunted the medieval imagination. They weren't simple tools. They were living dangers, unpredictable and mysterious, woven into the fabric of forgotten history. But the most unsettling part was yet to come. The blending of mirrors with death rituals and ghost stories, where superstition and folklore collided to create tales of souls forever trapped in glass. When the medieval mind turned to death, the mirror loomed like a silent companion. We've already seen how mirrors were covered during wakes to keep souls from being trapped. But the fear went further, into tales of restless spirits, curses, and even mirrors that carried the dead within them. Imagine this. You're in a candlelit cottage. The family mourns a relative who passed the night before. In the corner stands a mirror, forgotten, its surface uncovered. Days later, the villagers whisper that strange shapes appear inside it. A pale hand, a flicker of movement, a voice calling when no one is near. These weren't idle campfire stories. Medieval chronicles and later folklore preserve accounts of haunted mirrors, objects believed to hold the spirits of the dead. Some were said to bring illness to anyone who looked too long. Others became omens of misfortune, shattering at the moment of disaster. In England, there are records of mirrors being ritually buried with the dead to prevent their spirits from returning. In Germany, tales spread of mirrors that remembered those who had died before them, replaying their faces like trapped memories. At the root of all this was a deep belief that the soul and its reflection were bound together. Medieval theologians debated this idea, but among common folk it was taken as truth. If your reflection could be seen, then part of your soul must be present. And if that reflection could linger, so too could your soul. This explains why people feared mirrors near the dying. They believed the soul, fragile at the moment of departure, might slip into the reflective surface instead of journeying heavenward. Imagine the horror. A loved one's soul, imprisoned forever in a cold, silent mirror, unable to escape. Covering mirrors was not the only ritual. In parts of Europe, it was common to turn mirrors to face the wall or even carry them outside during funerals. Some households washed mirrors with holy water after a death, believing this would cleanse them of the lingering spirit. Even the act of cleaning a mirror took on symbolic weight. A dull, dusty mirror suggested a weakened soul, while a clear, polished one reflected vitality. To polish a mirror after a funeral was to release the soul and invite life back into the home. These beliefs fueled ghost stories that circulated from taverns to monasteries. People swore they saw dead relatives peering back at them, or shadows that didn't quite match their movements. One chilling legend from France tells of a woman who gazed into her mirror, only to see not her face, but the skull of her late husband staring back. Another, from Bohemia, warns of mirrors that devoured shadows, leaving the unlucky victim pale, weak, and close to death. Were these real? Likely not. But to the medieval imagination, they were proof that mirrors were not passive objects. They were active players in the eternal struggle between life and the afterlife. And yet, even as mirrors carried this heavy spiritual weight, they also occupied a strangely ordinary place in daily life. People dressed by them, merchants sold them, nobles displayed them as luxuries. This contradiction, an object both mundane and terrifying, is what kept them so deeply fascinating. But perhaps the most unsettling part is this: echoes of these fears are still alive today. Because even now, in our modern world, we still whisper superstitions about mirrors. And those echoes, faint but persistent, may be the greatest legacy of medieval belief. Fast forward to today. Glass mirrors are everywhere, on walls, in handbags, glowing back at us from phone screens. And yet, the medieval fear of mirrors never fully vanished. We joke about it, but this superstition is ancient. It originated with Roman belief that life renewed every 7 years, so a broken mirror meant a broken soul cycle. In medieval Europe, this merged with fears of spiritual harm. To break a mirror was to wound your reflection and, by extension, yourself. Even now, people instinctively flinch at the sound of shattering glass. Few laugh when told of the 7 years curse. It lingers, a ghost of forgotten history hiding in plain sight. This practice survives in pockets of Eastern Europe, in parts of Jewish tradition, and in folklore across Latin America. While the reasons differ, some religious, others cultural, the medieval root remains: protect the soul and keep it from being trapped in the glass. Stories of haunted mirrors still circulate today. From antique shops to old hotels, people claim to see faces in reflective surfaces or shadows that move when no one is near. Ghost hunting shows, whether you believe them or not, often feature mirrors as focal points of supernatural activity. These tales resonate because they tap into a primal fear, the idea that what we see in the mirror isn't always just ourselves. Interestingly, modern psychology has also explored this. There's a phenomenon known as the strange face illusion. If you stare into a mirror for too long in dim light, your brain begins to distort the image. Faces warp, shadows move, and you may even see unfamiliar figures. Science explains it as neural fatigue and perception tricks, but to a medieval villager, it would have been undeniable proof of spirits. So even with all our science, a shadow of the old fear lingers. Perhaps mirrors will always be a little unsettling. Perhaps deep down, we all share that medieval suspicion that somewhere behind the glass, something is watching. In the medieval world, mirrors didn't just raise fears of death and demons, they raised fears of the self, and this was in many ways just as terrifying. The church taught that vanity or excessive pride in one's appearance was among the most dangerous temptations. Pride was Lucifer's sin, the sin that led angels to fall. To gaze too long at yourself in a mirror was not simply foolish, it was spiritually perilous. Imagine a young woman in a medieval town combing her hair before a polished metal mirror. Neighbors might whisper that she cared too much about her reflection, that she risked inviting the devil. Sermons warned that mirrors lured people into sin, tricking them into obsessing over the body instead of the soul. And so mirrors became objects of suspicion, not just because they might trap souls, but because they encouraged sinful thoughts. Looking at your reflection wasn't innocent, it was dangerous. Medieval preachers often described the devil as using mirrors to trick the faithful. In one 13th century sermon, a friar warned that Satan lays hold of the eyes through the glass, and through the eyes he takes the soul. To see oneself too clearly was to risk forgetting God. This belief made mirrors especially threatening for women, who were often accused of vanity. Some moral tracts even suggested that mirrors in women's chambers should be smashed, lest they become tools of temptation. Stories spread of people punished for their pride in mirrors. One legend told of a noblewoman who spent hours gazing at her reflection. When she died, villagers claimed her soul was forever trapped in her mirror, her beautiful face fading into a skull over time. The mirror was passed down as a cursed object, bringing misfortune to all who owned it. These stories reinforced the warning. Mirrors could destroy not only your soul but your reputation. To use them too freely was to invite gossip, envy, and suspicion. Even simple acts were laced with caution. People might glance briefly into a mirror to straighten clothing, but to linger was risky. Parents sometimes told children that if they stared too long into a mirror, their face would warp or freeze. This merged with another superstition, the belief that mirrors could steal beauty. To spend too much time admiring yourself was to drain your vitality, leaving you pale and lifeless. Thus, vanity was not only sinful, it was physically dangerous. And yet, despite these warnings, mirrors continued to spread. Nobles and wealthy merchants collected them as luxury goods, symbols of power. This tension between temptation and fear created the perfect storm of superstition that kept mirrors mysterious well into the Renaissance. But mirrors didn't exist only in sermons and households. They also found their way into art, literature, and legends, where their symbolic power became even stranger. Mirrors were not only feared in daily life, they became powerful symbols in art, literature, and legend. To the medieval imagination, the mirror was never neutral. It was a sign of truth, a warning of sin, or even a doorway to another world. In medieval manuscripts, saints and scholars are sometimes shown holding mirrors, but not to admire themselves. Instead, the mirror symbolized truth, the clear reflection of divine order. The Latin phrase speculum, mirror, was often used in book titles, such as Speculum Humanae Salvationis, the mirror of human salvation. These works weren't about vanity. They were about reflection in the spiritual sense, seeing the truth of God's word reflected in creation. For scholars, the mirror was a metaphor for the intellect, the way the human mind could reflect divine wisdom. But for ordinary people, that lofty symbolism often blurred with fear. Because what if the mirror didn't just reflect truth? What if it revealed too much? In poetry and moral plays, the mirror also became a warning. To look into it too often was to risk becoming Narcissus, the figure from Greek myth who wasted away after falling in love with his own reflection. Medieval writers retold this myth with Christian lessons. Vanity leads to destruction. In some tales, mirrors were said to reveal not beauty but corruption. A sinner might look into a mirror and see their face twisted, their skin crawling with worms, their reflection fading into a skull. These visions were allegorical, of course, but they carried weight. People truly believed that mirrors could reveal hidden truths about the soul. And then there were the legends, strange, often fantastical tales of mirrors with supernatural powers. The Mirror of King Solomon. Medieval lore claimed Solomon owned a mirror that could reveal angels and demons. Later versions of this story traveled through Arabic and Jewish traditions, blending magic with biblical authority. The Mirror of Alexander the Great. Chronicles told of a mirror placed in a tower that could show all the lands of the world. Some said it revealed the approach of enemies. Others claimed it displayed sea monsters beneath the waves. The fairy tale legacy. Though most fairy tales were written down later, medieval folklore already whispered of enchanted mirrors that spoke, cursed, or revealed hidden fates. These stories would later inspire the magic mirror of Snow White. Each of these legends reinforced the same idea. Mirrors were not passive. They could see too much, show too much, and sometimes demand a price. Medieval art often used mirrors to highlight the contrast between sacred and sinful. In paintings, the Virgin Mary was sometimes shown with a mirror, representing her purity as the spotless reflection of God's grace. By contrast, depictions of witches or demons with mirrors suggested deception, trickery, and corruption. Even in later medieval and early Renaissance art, the mirror became a test of the viewer. In Jan van Eyck's famous Arnolfini portrait, 1434, a convex mirror reflects not just the couple, but also unseen figures in the room. This detail blurred the line between reality and illusion, echoing the older fear that mirrors might show things beyond the living eye. Some of the most unsettling legends spoke of mirror worlds, realms that existed inside the glass. To stare too long was to risk falling in. In Slavic folklore, people warned children never to look into mirrors at night, when their reflections could step out and steal their place. In German folk tales, mirrors were said to show the devil standing just behind you, visible only in the glass. These legends gave mirrors a presence that was both intimate and terrifying. Every time someone looked into one, they weren't just seeing themselves. They were touching a world just beyond reach. We have seen how medieval villagers treated mirrors with suspicion, covering them during funerals, whispering prayers before looking into them, and warning children never to stare too long. But one question lingers behind all of these stories. Why did people see what they saw? Why did so many believe that mirrors revealed spirits, trapped souls, or opened portals to unseen realms? The answer lies not only in superstition, but in the workings of the human mind itself. What medieval people experienced was not always a fantasy invented by fear. Much of it came from real, powerful illusions of perception, illusions so unsettling that even today, with science at our fingertips, we can still fall victim to them. Imagine yourself stepping back in time into a medieval cottage. The air is thick with smoke from the hearth. Shadows quiver along the wooden walls. A single candle sputters on the table, casting an unsteady glow. You approach a small mirror, not made of flawless glass, but of polished metal, its surface uneven and cloudy. You lean closer, trying to fix your hair or straighten your tunic. And then, for just an instant, the face looking back at you does not seem like your own. The eyes are too deep, the smile a fraction too slow. Perhaps the jaw is narrower, or the cheekbones sharper. It is almost familiar, but not quite, and just as quickly it is gone, leaving only your face again. To a villager in the Middle Ages, this was no trick of the light. It was proof of the soul's fragility. It was confirmation that the mirror could steal a piece of you, or that a restless spirit had slipped inside. They had no reason to doubt it, because the experience felt utterly real. Modern science gives us words for what they could not explain. One of them is pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces where none exist. Our brains are so finely tuned to recognize human features that we find them in clouds, rocks, trees, and shadows. That instinct, so vital for survival, was also a trap. In the shifting blur of a medieval mirror, the mind could invent details that were never there. A trick of shadow became a watching presence. A distorted reflection became another face. For a villager who had been taught that mirrors were dangerous, these moments were more than coincidence. They were confirmation of everything the priests and neighbors warned about. But pareidolia was only the beginning. There is another stranger phenomenon that shows just how real these experiences could be. In 2010, an Italian psychologist named Giovanni Caputo asked volunteers to stare into a mirror in dim light for 10 minutes. The participants described what they saw in unsettling detail. Some said their faces melted into monstrous shapes. Others swore that they saw strangers standing in the glass. A few claimed that the faces of dead relatives appeared, watching them silently. This experiment gave birth to the term the strange face illusion. The explanation lies in how our visual system works. When we stare at the same image for too long, our brain begins to adapt, filtering out familiar features. In low light, the missing details are replaced with shadows, and the mind fills the void with imagined images. The result is a terrifying transformation of the reflection, one that feels as real as anything we see. Now imagine that same effect in a medieval setting. There is no steady electric light, no smooth modern glass, only warped metal and flickering candles. The conditions were perfect for the strange face illusion. When villagers stared too long, they were not imagining things out of thin air. They were seeing their own brains turn shadows into monsters, and without the language of science, the only explanation they had was that mirrors held power over their souls. Fear made these visions stronger. When people expect to see something, their minds are more likely to produce it. A villager told all his life that mirrors could trap souls, would interpret every flicker and shadow as proof. What began as a momentary distortion quickly became a haunting experience. Whispers spread from house to house, story to story, until the entire community accepted the mirror as a dangerous gateway. To the medieval imagination, this was not illusion, it was evidence. If a mirror could show you someone else's face, surely that meant another spirit was there. If the reflection shifted when you were alone, surely a demon was peering back. If the dead appeared, then the mirror was indeed a trap, keeping their souls prisoner within the glass. Even today, the strange face illusion has not lost its power. People who repeat Caputo's experiment often describe the same sensations medieval villagers once feared. The feeling that the mirror becomes alive, that the reflection is no longer under their control, that another presence is watching from just beyond the surface. For a few minutes, the boundary between self and other begins to blur. And this blurring is precisely what terrified medieval people. The mirror was supposed to show the self, but sometimes it showed something else. And if the reflection was not truly yours, then who or what did it belong to? That question was enough to send chills through households, to inspire laws and customs, to wrap the mirror in cloth whenever death approached. So in the end, the medieval fear of mirrors was not entirely irrational. Their eyes were telling them the truth, or at least what felt like truth. They really did see shifting faces, spirits, and souls caught in the glass. What they lacked was the explanation. And perhaps even with explanations, the feeling of unease never truly fades, because once you've seen something unfamiliar staring back from the mirror, whether in the Middle Ages or today, you can never quite shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, the mirror is more than glass. To fully understand the medieval fear of mirrors, we need to step beyond the church sermons, the magical legends, and the ghost stories. We need to see how mirrors actually existed in everyday life. how peasants, nobles, monks and travelers encountered them, and how those encounters shaped their beliefs. For most people in the Middle Ages, mirrors were not common household objects. They were expensive, fragile, and often reserved for those with wealth. A simple peasant family might never own a mirror at all. Their reflections appeared only in still ponds, in the surface of a polished pot, or in the faint shimmer of water carried in a wooden bucket. To see oneself was a rare experience, almost mystical. Imagine spending your whole life never knowing exactly what you looked like, only hearing comments from others or catching brief, rippling glimpses in a stream. To suddenly confront your face in a polished disc of metal would be shocking, uncanny, and maybe even frightening. It is little wonder that peasants whispered about souls being caught, because the reflection itself was already extraordinary. Among nobles and wealthy merchants, mirrors were symbols of status. Imported glass mirrors began appearing in parts of Europe by the 13th and 14th centuries, though the surfaces were still small, distorted, and costly. To own one was to display refinement and power. Yet with that prestige came danger. Nobles too heard the warnings of priests about vanity, and nobles too feared curses should a mirror crack. In some households, mirrors were kept covered when not in use, both to protect their delicate surfaces and to guard against unseen forces. A mirror on the wall of a great hall might gleam like a jewel, but it could also feel like an eye, watching silently from the shadows. In monasteries, mirrors took on another meaning altogether. Monks lived lives of discipline and humility. To spend time gazing at one's reflection was considered wasteful, even sinful. And yet, mirrors occasionally appeared in religious texts and teachings, not as physical objects of temptation, but as metaphors for the soul. To be virtuous was to polish one's soul until it reflected God's light, like a flawless mirror. To be sinful was to allow that reflection to grow clouded and dark. The irony was clear. In daily life, mirrors were feared, but in spiritual writing, the mirror became a guide for moral clarity. Travelers encountered mirrors in markets and fairs, where merchants sold them alongside trinkets and charms. These mirrors were often small and portable, sometimes set in decorated cases. Women might carry them as personal possessions, though not without gossip and suspicion. A woman glancing too long at her mirror in public risked whispers of vanity or even witchcraft. A man polishing his beard before a mirror could be mocked for pride. The simple act of looking at one's reflection carried a social weight that went far beyond appearance. And then there were the superstitions tied to particular moments of life. Brides were warned not to look into mirrors before their wedding, lest the reflection shatter their future happiness. Expectant mothers avoided mirrors during pregnancy, fearing that their unborn child's soul might be affected. Sick rooms were often stripped of mirrors entirely, so that weakened patients would not lose their souls to the glass. These customs were not just private choices. They were part of a communal rhythm of life in the Middle Ages, repeated across villages and towns, handed down from one generation to the next. Even children grew up with mirror stories. Parents warned them that if they made faces in the mirror, those faces might freeze forever. Others said that children who stared too long into a mirror would see the devil looking back. Such warnings kept young ones in line, but they also fed the larger cultural dread that mirrors were never entirely safe. The way mirrors were treated also depended on moments of crisis. During plagues, for example, mirrors were sometimes covered or turned to the wall, not only out of fear for the dead, but also to stop disease from reflecting into the household. During storms, villagers might hide or break old mirrors, believing lightning could strike them more easily, as if the glass attracted heavenly punishment. Even in times of famine, mirrors could inspire fear. People whispered that looking into one while hungry might draw the last bit of life from your body. What emerges from all of this is a picture of a world where mirrors were both ordinary and extraordinary, both tools and terrors. They existed in noble houses, monasteries, markets, and cottages, but wherever they appeared, they carried a weight far heavier than their polished surfaces. They were bound up with class, with morality, with health, and with death. For us today, a mirror is nothing but a glance in the bathroom, a quick check before leaving the house, a decoration on the wall. But for the people of the Middle Ages, a mirror was an encounter with the unknown. To look into it was to risk glimpsing not only yourself, but your soul, your sins, and the shadows of another world. And as we leave this chapter of daily life, another thought arises. If mirrors carried such weight in ordinary existence, what does that say about the people themselves? What does it reveal about how they viewed identity, survival, and the unseen forces that ruled their lives? The answer lies in the conclusion of our journey, the echoes of these beliefs that still linger in us centuries later. By now we know mirrors were feared across the medieval world, but those fears were not identical everywhere. Just as every village had its own customs for marriage, funerals, and festivals, so too did every region have its own mirror beliefs. Together they create a patchwork of strange, forgotten traditions that paint a fuller picture of life in the Middle Ages. In medieval England, mirrors appeared most often in stories of omens and warnings. Villagers whispered that if a mirror fell from the wall by itself, it foretold a death in the household. To leave a mirror uncovered during a storm risked drawing lightning, a sign of God's judgment. And in some towns it was said that if a child first saw their reflection in a mirror rather than in water, their life would be marked by misfortune. One legend from Norfolk told of a farmer who claimed to see the ghost of his dead wife in his looking-glass each night until he shattered it. Neighbors whispered that her soul had been trapped because the family forgot to cover the mirror during her wake. The shards were buried in a churchyard, a common way of releasing spirits bound to broken glass. In France, the church took a particularly strong stance against mirrors, connecting them with vanity and pride. Preachers warned that the devil himself might appear in a mirror to tempt women into obsession with their looks. Some stories describe mirrors as the devil's book, pages in which he wrote the names of the vain. Yet French folklore also gave mirrors protective roles. Travelers sometimes carried small polished discs to ward off evil spirits on lonely roads. In certain villages, mirrors were hung in barns to protect livestock from witchcraft, reflecting curses back onto their senders. German folklore abounds with stories of mirrors and souls. In Bavaria, it was believed that if two people looked into a mirror together, their souls could become entangled, causing bad luck in love or friendship. In other regions, parents told children never to look into a mirror by candlelight, warning that they might see not themselves, but a shadow soul that would cling to them until death. Haunted mirror tales were especially popular in German lands. One story tells of a noble family whose ancestral mirror showed not only their reflections, but also the faces of those fated to die. Each time the household suffered a loss, villagers swore the mirror had revealed it days before. In Italy, mirrors were tied closely to marriage customs. Brides were told never to look into a mirror after putting on their wedding dress or risk calling misfortune upon the union. To break this rule was to invite jealousy from spirits who might twist the bride's fate. At the same time, Italian folklore celebrated mirrors as romantic tools. Lovers sometimes exchanged small hand mirrors as tokens, believing they carried part of the giver's soul. Yet even these gifts carried risk. If the mirror cracked, the relationship was doomed. In Northern Europe, particularly in Scandinavian folklore, mirrors were heavily tied to death rituals. Covering mirrors after a death was strictly observed, and leaving one exposed was believed to trap not only the soul of the dead, but also the living who gazed into it. Some households kept no mirrors at all, fearing they gave restless spirits an entry point back into the world. Folk tales from Sweden and Norway speak of mirrors as gateways. One chilling story describes a mirror that showed drowned sailors still gasping for breath, their souls unable to leave the glass until the mirror was smashed and the shards cast into the sea. In Spain, mirrors carried associations with fortune and fate. Some believed a clean, polished mirror would bring prosperity to a household, while a cracked or cloudy one foretold poverty. In rural villages, fortune tellers used mirrors in love charms, instructing young women to look into them on certain nights to glimpse the face of their future husband. But even here, danger lurked. To see nothing in the mirror during such a ritual was considered a dire omen. It meant death would come before marriage. These regional variations remind us that medieval superstition was not uniform. Belief in mirrors was shaped by climate, geography, and local tradition. Yet the common thread is striking. Whether in England, France, Germany, Italy, Scandinavia, or Spain, the mirror was never merely an object. It was a participant in life's greatest mysteries: birth, love, misfortune, and death. The villagers who told these stories may never have met one another, yet across Europe they shared the same unease. Each distorted reflection, each shadow in the glass, carried the same weight, a reminder that human beings are never comfortable when faced with themselves. Mirrors were not only objects of fear in the homes of peasants or the rituals of small villages. They also carried enormous symbolic weight in the world of kings, queens, and the church. For rulers, mirrors were far more than polished surfaces. They were tools of authority, reminders of divine order, and even instruments of control. In royal courts, mirrors became symbols of truth and justice. The ruler, gazing into a mirror, was expected to see not vanity, but the reflection of their role as God's representative on earth. Chronicles describe coronation rituals in which mirrors or reflective objects were present, underscoring the idea that the monarch was both a person and a reflection of divine will. To govern justly was to hold the mirror of truth before the people. To govern unjustly was to shatter that reflection. The Church also embraced the symbolism of the mirror. The Latin word speculum, meaning mirror, appears in countless medieval texts. Works like the Speculum Humanae Salvationis, or Mirror of Human Salvation, presented themselves as reflective guides, teaching the faithful to see their lives as mirrors of Scripture. Preachers spoke of the soul as a mirror, which could be polished with prayer and charity, or clouded by sin. In these contexts, the mirror was elevated into something holy, yet always with the risk that it could be turned to evil. But even as mirrors carried this lofty symbolism, they also became weapons of politics. To accuse someone of being enchanted by mirrors was to accuse them of witchcraft or vanity, charges that could ruin reputations. Rumors spread of courtiers who used enchanted mirrors to spy on rivals, of queens who consulted mirrors not for beauty but for omens. These tales blurred the line between political intrigue and superstition. One particularly striking example comes from the court of Louis XV of France, who was said to have owned a magical mirror that revealed the loyalty or treachery of his courtiers. Whether or not the mirror existed is irrelevant. The story itself carried power, for it suggested that no one could hide their soul from the king's gaze. In this way, the myth of mirrors reinforced authority, turning fear into obedience. Mirrors also appeared in public rituals of shame and punishment. In some towns, convicted criminals were forced to look into mirrors as part of their sentencing, a symbolic reminder of their sins. The reflection was thought to confront them with their corrupted souls. The mirror in these cases became a silent executioner of reputation. Among the nobility, mirrors were also symbols of wealth. To own a large, polished mirror was to display both power and risk. Guests who visited might be impressed by its beauty, but also wary of the dangers it contained. Stories of mirrors cracking during feasts or celebrations were taken as omens, warnings that pride and excess would be punished. For rulers who balanced on the edge of divine favor and popular fear, such superstitions mattered. The symbolism even extended to art commissioned by the powerful. In illuminated manuscripts, kings and queens were sometimes shown holding mirrors as symbols of wisdom, purity, or divine reflection. But the same object could also be painted in the hands of demons, witches, or allegorical figures representing pride. The duality of the mirror was clear. It could raise a ruler up or cast them down. This political dimension of mirrors shows us something profound about the medieval world. Fear of mirrors was not just about souls and spirits, it was about power. The same beliefs that caused villagers to cover mirrors at funerals also allowed rulers to claim divine authority, to inspire awe and to reinforce control. Mirrors reflected not only faces, but hierarchies, not only souls, but systems of order. In this way, the medieval mirror was a paradox. It was both humble and grand, both feared and revered. It hung on the wall of a poor cottage covered in cloth, and also glittered in the hall of a king, symbolizing truth and power. And no matter where it was found, it carried the same unsettling suggestion. The mirror could reveal more than you wanted to see. For peasants, nobles, and priests, mirrors were often objects of superstition, bound to souls, omens, and sins. But in the world of medieval medicine and science, what we might now call natural philosophy, They were also tools for exploration. Physicians, alchemists, and scholars experimented with mirrors not only as objects of fear, but as instruments of knowledge, and the results were just as strange as the superstitions. Doctors of the Middle Ages lived in a world balanced between faith and observation. They studied ancient texts from Hippocrates, Galen, and Aristotle, often blending them with Christian theology. In these writings, the mirror appeared not as a magical portal, but as a way to understand the body and the mind. Some physicians claimed that a person's health could be judged by how their reflection appeared. A bright, clear image meant vitality. A dim, clouded one suggested weakness or disease. Patients were sometimes asked to look into a mirror, so the doctor could observe subtle changes in complexion or expression. What we might today call early diagnosis was, for them, another way of reading the soul through glass. But medical uses of mirrors went further. In certain texts, mirrors were described as instruments for focusing light, similar to what we now know as magnifying lenses. Scholars observed that polished surfaces could reflect sunlight strongly enough to burn cloth or ignite kindling. To them, this seemed like proof that mirrors could harness hidden powers of nature. Some even speculated that illnesses might be burned away by reflected light, though such treatments rarely succeeded. Alchemists, those seekers of hidden truths, gold, and eternal life, were especially fascinated by mirrors. They saw in the mirror a metaphor for transformation. Just as base metal could, in theory, be polished into gold, so too could the soul be polished into perfection. Alchemists crafted strange devices known as scrying mirrors, often of obsidian or polished brass, to search for visions of the philosopher's stone or the secrets of the cosmos. To outsiders, these rituals looked like sorcery. To the alchemists, they were experiments in the hidden science of the universe. The connection between mirrors and eyesight also intrigued medieval scholars. They debated how vision worked. Did the eye send out rays to touch objects, or did objects send their images into the eye? Mirrors complicated the matter, bending images, doubling them, creating illusions. The philosopher Roger Bacon, writing in the 13th century, experimented with curved mirrors, noting how they magnified or distorted reflections. To him, this was evidence that mirrors could unlock the secrets of light and vision. In time, such studies would lead to the development of spectacles, telescopes, and microscopes, but in the Middle Ages, they were wrapped in an aura of mystery. There were also bizarre medical superstitions tied to mirrors. Some believed that staring into a mirror while sick could draw the illness out of the body, transferring it into the glass. Others feared the opposite, that a sick person might infect the mirror, causing anyone who later looked into it to fall ill. In this way, mirrors became both cures and carriers of disease, their reflective surfaces seen as fragile boundaries between health and harm. One particularly curious belief held that mirrors could reveal fevers before they fully set in. A patient would breathe upon a mirror, and the doctor would examine the condensation. If the fog lingered, it was said the illness was deep in the body. If it cleared quickly, recovery was near. This was less a superstition than a crude diagnostic method, yet it carried the same eerie atmosphere, the mirror revealing secrets invisible to the naked eye. The overlap between medicine and magic was always thin. A healer might prescribe covering mirrors in a sick room to prevent the patient's soul from slipping away, even while using a mirror to check their complexion. An alchemist might polish a disc for scrying while also experimenting with light and reflection. The mirror sat at the crossroads of science and superstition, where the pursuit of knowledge often walked hand in hand with fear. And in this strange blend of medicine, philosophy, and magic, mirrors became instruments not only of survival, but of imagination. They showed scholars glimpses of possibilities beyond their reach, and for villagers, they confirmed what they already believed, that mirrors were not to be trusted. Long before medieval villagers whispered about souls caught in glass, older civilizations had already filled the mirror with myth. Their stories survived through manuscripts, travelers' tales, and oral traditions, eventually merging into the fabric of medieval superstition. To truly understand the medieval fear of mirrors, we must go further back, into the myths of Greece, Rome, the Norse sagas, and the folk traditions that fed the medieval imagination. In the ancient world of Greece, mirrors often carried associations with truth, but also with destruction. The story of Narcissus is perhaps the most famous. The young man, so entranced by his reflection in a still pool, wasted away until he became a flower. Medieval Christians retold this tale with a moral twist, using it as a warning against vanity and pride. But the original myth already captured the danger of reflection, the way a face could steal your attention, rob your strength, and bind your soul. Some medieval writers even compared the still surface of a pond to a mirror, suggesting that water itself could trap the unwary, just as glass or metal might. To look into your reflection for too long was not only dangerous, it was a kind of doom. Roman superstition also played a major role in shaping medieval ideas. The Romans believed that breaking a mirror brought 7 years of bad luck, a superstition that lingers with us today. They explained it through their understanding of life cycles, claiming the soul renewed itself every 7 years. A broken reflection meant a broken soul, a cycle cut short. When this belief filtered into the Middle Ages, it mingled with Christian fears of sin and divine punishment, giving mirrors the aura of an object that could curse simply by shattering. But Roman tales went further. Writers like Pliny the Elder described mirrors as instruments not only of vanity, but of prophecy. He noted strange practices where mirrors were used to catch glimpses of omens. These accounts were preserved in manuscripts and spread across Europe, feeding the medieval suspicion that mirrors were tied to powers no human should command. The Norse sagas give us another perspective. In the cold northern lands, mirrors were rare, but the idea of reflection was bound up with water and ice. To gaze into a frozen pond or a still lake was to risk seeing more than yourself. Norse mythology is filled with tales of visions seen in water, of gods and heroes who glimpsed fate in reflective surfaces. One story speaks of Odin sacrificing an eye for wisdom, a symbol later tied by some scholars to the act of reflection. The price paid for knowledge glimpsed in surfaces that show more than the living world. To the Norse imagination, reflections were a dangerous gift, offering truth at the cost of safety. As Christianity spread across these lands, older myths did not simply vanish, they folded themselves into new stories. Villagers who once feared water spirits waiting beneath the surface began to fear souls trapped in mirrors instead. The shape of the superstition changed, but the unease remained. Slavic folklore, too, contributed its shadows. In the villages of Eastern Europe, stories circulated of mirrors that could capture the wandering dead. Some told of restless spirits pressing their faces to the glass, desperate to escape. Others warned that children should never look into mirrors before they learned to speak, or their voices might be stolen forever. These tales crept westward, blending with the Christian rituals of covering mirrors after a death, reinforcing the belief that glass could imprison the soul at its most vulnerable moment. In Celtic lands, mirrors, or reflective surfaces of any kind, were bound to the otherworld. Streams and wells were sacred places, portals to the realms of gods and fairies. To look into them was to risk contact with beings beyond human control. When polished metal mirrors appeared, it was easy for villagers to treat them as miniature portals, no less dangerous than the enchanted waters of their ancestors. Medieval writers often condemned these pagan associations, but the folk beliefs endured, passed down in whispers and local customs. Even further afield, echoes of Egyptian myth reached the Middle Ages through manuscripts and trade. The Egyptians had long associated mirrors with Hathor, the goddess of beauty, music, and fertility. Yet their mirrors also carried funerary significance, placed in tombs as protective charms. Medieval scholars reading these accounts centuries later folded them into their own interpretations, sometimes warning that foreign beliefs proved mirrors were inherently dangerous, tempting humans to treat them as sacred when they should be feared. The continuity across these cultures is striking. Whether in Greece, Rome, Norse lands, or Celtic villages, reflections were never ordinary. They were thresholds, thin, shining surfaces that separated the living from the unseen. To look into them was to risk crossing over. For the medieval imagination, inheriting these myths was like inheriting a library of warnings. Every flicker in the glass, every distorted face, was reinforced by centuries of stories telling them that mirrors were not safe. These myths also gave the mirror its duality. In Greece, the reflection could teach or destroy. In Rome, It could reveal omens or curse the soul. In Norse tales, it offered wisdom at a terrible price. In Slavic stories, it imprisoned the dead. And in Celtic traditions, it opened doorways to other realms. The medieval fear of mirrors was not an isolated superstition, but the culmination of thousands of years of myth converging into a single powerful belief. That to see oneself reflected was never just to see the surface. It was to risk glimpsing the edge of another world. What makes these stories so powerful is not that they belong to the past, but that they still live in us. The myth of Narcissus survives in warnings against vanity. The Roman superstition of 7 years bad luck still makes us wince when glass shatters. Tales of haunted mirrors echo through horror films and ghost stories, modern versions of ancient fears. The myths remain, reshaped but not forgotten, just as our medieval ancestors carried them forward from the cultures before them. And so when we look into the medieval mirror, we are not just seeing the Middle Ages. We are seeing Greece, Rome, the Norse, the Celts, the Slavs, the Egyptians, a tapestry of civilizations, all whispering the same truth. Be careful what you see in the glass, for it may not belong only to you. We have wandered a long road together, through cottages lit by flickering firelight, across noble halls where mirrors glittered like jewels, into monasteries where reflections became metaphors for the soul, and out into the vast landscape of myths that stretch from Greece to Rome, from Norse sagas to Celtic wells. At every step, mirrors revealed themselves to be more than objects. They were questions. They were thresholds. They were the most ordinary things in the world, and yet, somehow, they were never safe. Now, as we reach the end of this journey, let us return once more to that simple image, a person standing in front of a mirror. In the Middle Ages, this moment was layered with fear, ritual, and meaning. To stand before your own reflection was to risk pride, to tempt fate, to brush against the invisible. A child might be warned away, a mourner might cover the glass, a healer might watch carefully for signs of sickness. All of life's stages, birth, marriage, illness, death, had their mirror rituals. What seems to us like superstition was, for them, a way of making sense of a world filled with uncertainty. When we step back, it becomes clear that the mirror was not really about glass or polished metal. It was about the deepest human questions. What is the soul? Can it be stolen? What happens when we die? Is there another world beyond the one we see? These are questions that science can explain only in part, but that myth and superstition have always been eager to answer. Mirrors became symbols of those answers, sometimes comforting, often terrifying, but always powerful. Even today, we still carry pieces of this past with us. We may not cover mirrors during funerals, but in some cultures the practice remains. We may not whisper prayers over broken glass, but we still mutter about 7 years of bad luck. We may not fear demons in reflections, but we still tell ghost stories of haunted mirrors, mirrors that move, mirrors that remember the dead. And even if we laugh deep down, we still hesitate when we catch something strange in the corner of our eye. Perhaps this is why mirrors continue to unsettle us. They remind us that the line between self and other, between the known and the unknown, is fragile. Stare too long, and the face looking back may not be entirely yours. It may belong to memory, to fear, to imagination, or to something older than all of these. The Middle Ages gave us one answer: the mirror can trap your soul. Science gives us another: the brain is playing tricks. But maybe the truth is that both are part of the same story, the human need to make sense of the uncanny. So as we close, I invite you to linger for a moment with your own reflection, not just as a daily habit, not just as a quick glance, but as a quiet meditation. Stand before the glass, breathe, and look. Feel the weight of centuries pressing behind your gaze. Imagine the voices of medieval villagers whispering their warnings. Imagine the myths of Rome and Greece echoing their tales. Imagine the Norse gods and Celtic spirits stirring in the shadows of your face. In that moment, you will not only see yourself, you will see a history that lives on in every reflection. Thank you for joining me on this long journey into the strange, the bizarre, and the forgotten. The story of mirrors is a reminder that history is not only about kings and battles, it is about fears and beliefs, about the small rituals that gave people comfort, about the way ordinary objects can carry extraordinary meaning. And perhaps as you leave this story behind and step into your own life, you will carry a little of that meaning with you. When you next look into a mirror, remember, countless generations have stood where you stand, felt what you feel, and wondered the same things you may wonder now. What is it that I see? Who is it that looks back? And is the reflection only mine?